Close your eyes now and let yourself drift back through the mists of time, back through centuries of cobblestone streets and flickering candlelight, back to a city that would become the stage for one of humanity's most devastating dramas. Tonight, we're going to walk together through the entire history of the London Plague, a story so vast and so quietly horrifying that it spans hundreds of years, touching the lives of millions who lived, loved, and died in the shadow of an invisible enemy. So settle in, get comfortable, and if you enjoy these journeys through history, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for dreamless timelines. Trust me, you're gonna want to come back for more of these deep dives into the past. And hey, drop a like and let me know in the comments which historical event you'd like me to cover next. Now, let the present fade away as we step into medieval London. The year is 1348, and London is a city of roughly 40,000 souls, packed tightly within its ancient Roman walls. The streets are narrow, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass, and they're lined with timber-framed houses that lean so far over the roadways that neighbors in upper floors can shake hands across the gap. The smell is something you'd never forget, a thick cocktail of human waste, rotting food, animal dung, and the smoky tang of countless cooking fires. There are no sewers as we know them, just open channels running down the middle of streets, carrying all manner of filth toward the Thames. Pigs wander freely, acting as the city's garbage disposal system, and rats, well, rats are just part of the landscape, as common as pigeons are today. But on this particular autumn morning, something is different. Word has been spreading for months now, carried by merchants and travelers from the continent, whispered in taverns and marketplaces with a kind of hushed dread. A great sickness has swept across Europe, they say, moving from village to village, city to city, leaving death in its wake on a scale nobody has ever seen. They call it the Great Mortality, or the Pestilence, and the stories that reach London are almost too terrible to believe. Entire towns emptied, bodies piled in the streets, mass grave that can't be dug fast enough. The people of London don't know it yet, but they're about to experience something that will fundamentally reshape their city, their society, and their understanding of mortality itself. The Black Death is coming to London, and it's going to change everything. Let's drift back just a little further, though, because to understand the plague's arrival in London, we need to understand where it came from and how it moved across the medieval world like a dark wave. The story really begins in Central Asia, in the steppes and trading posts along the Silk Road, where sometime in the early 1340s, the bacterium Yersinia pestis found its way into populations of black rats and the fleas that lived on them. This wasn't the first time this particular pathogen had emerged. Plague has been with humanity for thousands of years, but this outbreak was going to be something special in the worst possible way. The disease spread along trade routes, moving with caravans and ships, traveling in the bodies of infected rats and fleas, hidden in bales of cloth and sacks of grain. It reached the Crimean Peninsula by 1346, and from there it was only a matter of time before it hopped aboard merchant vessels bound for European ports. By late 1347, it had arrived in Sicily, and from there it spread like wildfire through Italy, France, and Spain. The speed was terrifying. In some places, half the population would die within months. Now, medieval people had no concept of germs or bacteria. They didn't understand contagion the way we do. Instead, they interpreted the plague through the lens of their own worldview, which was deeply religious and shaped by ancient medical theories that would seem bizarre to us now. Many believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, a divine judgment that demanded repentance and prayer. Others subscribed to the theory of miasma, the idea that diseases were caused by bad air or corrupted atmospheres, often emanating from swamps, rotting matter, or celestial events. Some physicians pointed to an unusual alignment of planets that occurred in 1345, claiming that Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had come together in the sign of Aquarius, creating a corruption in the air that led to the pestilence. Others blamed earthquakes, which they said had released poisonous vapors from the Earth's core. And of course, there were those who sought human scapegoats, particularly Jewish communities, who faced horrific persecution as they were falsely accused of poisoning wells. It's a dark reminder that in times of crisis, fear and ignorance can lead people to do unspeakable things. As autumn turns to winter in 1348, ships continue to arrive at London's busy docks, bringing goods from the continent and unknowingly bringing death. The Port of London is the commercial heart of England, a chaotic jumble of wharves and warehouses where merchants from across Europe come to trade wool, wine, cloth, and spices. It's exactly the kind of bustling, crowded, rat-infested environment where plague can thrive. The first cases probably appear in the dockside parishes, among the labourers, sailors, and merchants who work the waterfront. At first, it might seem like just another fever. People get sick all the time in medieval London, where disease is a constant companion. But this illness is different. It comes on suddenly and violently. Victims develop painful swellings in their groin, armpits, or neck, egg-sized lumps called buboes that give this form of plague its name, the bubonic plague. These swellings are excruciatingly painful, and they're accompanied by high fever, chills, exhaustion, and delirium. Some victims develop a different form of the disease, one that attacks the lungs. Pneumonic plague, as we now call it, is even more deadly and can spread directly from person to person through coughing. Those who contract this form typically die within 2 or 3 days, coughing up blood and struggling for breath until the end. And then there's septicemic plague, where the infection spreads through the bloodstream, causing tissue death that turns the skin black. This is where the name Black Death might have come from, though historians still debate the exact origin of that term. For the people experiencing these symptoms, it must have been absolutely terrifying. Imagine feeling perfectly fine one day, maybe a little tired, and then the next day you're burning with fever, your body is racked with pain, and strange lumps are swelling under your skin. And you look around and see that this is happening to your neighbors, your family, people you've known your whole life, and they're dying, not slowly over weeks or months, but quickly within days. And there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. The physicians of London, trained in the medical theories of ancient Greek and Roman texts, are completely out of their depth. They try everything they know, bloodletting to balance the humours, applying poultices of various herbs to the buboes, burning aromatic woods to purify the air, but nothing works. If anything, bloodletting probably makes things worse, weakening patients who are already fighting for their lives. Some doctors refuse to treat plague patients at all, fearing infection. Others, to their credit, continue to minister to the sick despite the obvious danger. Many of these brave souls will die for their dedication. The same is true of priests, who are called to give last rites to the dying. In a deeply Christian society, the spiritual care of the dying is considered essential, but it means priests are constantly exposed to infection. The death toll among the clergy will be devastating. Now, as we drift deeper into this story, let me paint you a picture of what daily life becomes like as the plague takes hold of London. By early 1349, the disease has spread from the waterfront into the heart of the city, and it's clear that this is not going to be a brief outbreak. This is going to be something unprecedented. The first thing that changes is the sound of the city. London has always been noisy, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers, the calls of street vendors, the rumble of cart wheels on cobblestones, the shouts of children playing, the bells of dozens of churches marking the hours. But as the death toll rises, the city grows quieter. Shops close, markets empty. The streets, usually thronged with people, become less crowded. And the church bells, those bells that normally ring for weddings, for festivals, for the celebration of Mass, now they ring almost constantly for funerals. Actually, the bells ring so frequently for the dead that authorities eventually order them to stop. The constant tolling is too depressing. Too frightening for those who remain, so the bells fall silent, which is somehow even more eerie. Families quickly learn that when someone falls ill, they need to act fast. If your loved one shows symptoms, you have maybe 3 days before they die, maybe less. There's a desperate scramble to get affairs in order, to make wills, to receive the sacraments, and then the death, and then the burial. But as the plague worsens, even these basic rituals become impossible to maintain properly. The existing churchyards fill up quickly. Churches have traditionally buried their parishioners in the consecrated grounds surrounding the church building, but these plots are small, designed for the normal trickle of deaths in a community, not for this flood. So bodies begin to pile up. Gravediggers can't work fast enough. The city authorities have to open emergency burial grounds outside the city walls, great pits where bodies are laid in layers, dozens at a time, without individual grave markers, without ceremony. One of these emergency cemeteries is established at East Smithfield, just outside the city's eastern wall. Archaeological excavations in the 1980s and 1990s uncovered this burial ground, revealing the remains of over 2,500 plague victims, buried in neat rows, with remarkable care considering the circumstances. It's a sobering reminder that even in the midst of catastrophe, people tried to maintain some dignity for the dead. But not everyone gets even that much. In the poorest parts of the city, in the slums and alleys where dozens of people might live in a single decrepit building, bodies are sometimes just carried out and left in the street for collection carts. Bring out your dead, the cry that will become grimly familiar over the centuries, though actually that particular phrase is more associated with later plague outbreaks. In 1349, the collection is a bit more informal, but no less grim. The social fabric of the city begins to tear. Commerce slows to a crawl. Why would you go to market if it means risking infection? Why would you open your shop? Many merchants flee the city entirely, those who can afford to, taking their families to rural estates where they hope the air is cleaner and the disease less likely to reach them. King Edward III leaves London, moving his court from place to place to stay ahead of the plague. Parliament is suspended, courts close. The machinery of government grinds to a halt. And the people who remain, who don't have the option of fleeing, they cope in different ways. Some turn to religion with renewed fervor, attending Mass more frequently, saying prayers, making vows and offerings to the saints. There's a belief that if they can demonstrate sufficient piety, sufficient repentance, maybe God will spare them. Churches are packed with people praying for deliverance. Others take a different approach. If death is coming anyway, if tomorrow is not promised, why not enjoy today? There are reports of wild behavior, of people drinking, feasting, and engaging in all manner of excess, basically saying, screw it, we're all gonna die anyway, might as well go out having a good time. It's a very human response to existential dread, actually. And then there are those who try to continue as normal, because what else can you do? You still need to eat. You still need to take care of your family. So you keep your head down, you avoid crowds when you can, and you pray that the next knock on the door isn't someone coming to tell you that your neighbor has fallen ill. The economic impacts are immediate and severe. With so many people dying or fleeing, there's a sudden shortage of labor. Fields go unplowed, shops go unmanned, construction projects are abandoned. The wool trade, which is the backbone of England's economy, is disrupted as both producers and buyers die or disappear. Prices for goods become erratic. Some things skyrocket in price because nobody's producing them, while other goods become worthless because there's nobody to buy them. For the survivors, especially those in the laboring classes, this labor shortage will eventually create opportunities. Before the plague, England had an abundance of workers, which meant landlords and employers could pay low wages and impose strict conditions. But after the plague kills off a huge chunk of the workforce, suddenly workers are in demand. Laborers begin to demand higher wages, better conditions, more freedom. The old feudal order, where peasants are tied to the land and owe service to their lords, begins to crack. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the midst of the outbreak, in the winter and spring of 1349, nobody's thinking about long-term economic changes. They're just trying to survive. The plague rages through London for months. There's some debate about exactly how many died. Medieval records are incomplete and sometimes contradictory, but most historians estimate that somewhere between a third and half of London's population perished. That's between 15,000 and 20,000 people dead in a single year. The scale is almost incomprehensible. And London wasn't unique. The plague swept through all of England, killing similar proportions of the population in towns and villages across the country. Nationwide, perhaps 40 to 60% of the population died. Similar death tolls occurred across Europe. Entire villages were abandoned, bloodlines ended, knowledge and skills were lost when craftsmen died without passing on their expertise. If you're still with me, listening to this story late at night, I want to remind you that you're not alone on this journey through history. The Dreamless Timelines community is here, exploring these deep historical narratives together. If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode. And let me know in the comments, are you learning something new tonight? What other historical topics should I cover? Now let's drift forward a bit. By late 1349, the worst of the outbreak seems to have passed. The death rate slows. The plague hasn't disappeared entirely. There are still cases here and there, but the epidemic wave has crested and is beginning to recede. The survivors emerge, blinking, into a transformed world. London in 1350 is a ghost of its former self. Streets that were crowded are now half empty. Houses stand vacant, their inhabitants dead or fled. Entire families have been wiped out, leaving properties with no clear owners. The city smells different too, without as many people, animals, and cooking fires. There's less of that overwhelming urban reek, though the stench of death has added its own grim note. The survivors face a massive cleanup job. Bodies have to be properly buried. Abandoned houses have to be dealt with. The government has to figure out how to function again with a decimated workforce. It's a slow, painful recovery. But here's the thing about plague. It doesn't just come once and then disappear forever. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, establishes itself in rodent populations, creating reservoirs of infection that can flare up again whenever conditions are right. And that's exactly what happens. The Black Death of 1348-1349 is just the first wave, the big one, the one that kills the most people and has the most dramatic impact. But it's followed by repeated outbreaks over the next 3 centuries. There's another major outbreak in 1361, sometimes called the Pesti Secunda, the Second Plague. This one seems to hit children particularly hard, perhaps because they lack immunity that some survivors of the first outbreak might have developed, or perhaps because this is a slightly different strain. Then there's another in 1369, and another in 1374, and on and on. These later outbreaks don't kill as many people as the first one, partly because the population is already reduced, but also possibly because the disease evolves or people develop some resistance. But they're still deadly, still frightening, still disruptive. For Londoners, living with plague becomes part of life. It's like a chronic condition of the city. Every few years there's an outbreak. Some are minor, just a few dozen cases. Others are more serious, killing thousands. And there's always the fear that this year's outbreak might turn into something as bad as 1348. People develop strategies for dealing with these recurring outbreaks. When plague appears in a neighborhood, wealthy residents flee to the countryside. This becomes such a common pattern that rural areas near London develop reputations as plague refuges. The city of Bath, with its supposedly healing waters, becomes popular. So does the countryside of Kent and Surrey. For those who can't afford to flee, there are other precautions. Some people carry pomanders, little balls of aromatic substances like cloves, cinnamon, or musk, which they hold to their noses, believing the sweet smell will ward off the bad air that carries plague. Physicians develop elaborate costumes for treating plague patients, including the famous plague doctor outfit with its long, bird-like beak filled with aromatic herbs. These outfits don't actually provide much protection, but they must have been psychologically comforting to both doctors and patients. There are also quarantine measures. If someone in a house falls ill with plague, the authorities might order the entire household to stay inside for 40 days, quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. A red cross is painted on the door, along with the words "Lord have mercy upon us," to warn others to stay away. Guards are sometimes posted to enforce the quarantine, preventing anyone from leaving. This must have been absolutely terrifying for the people locked inside. If one person has plague, chances are the others in the house will catch it. So you're essentially locked in with death, waiting to see if you'll be next. Food and supplies are left outside the door, but otherwise you're cut off from the world. And if you do get sick, well, you're going to die surrounded only by your frightened family members. Not surprisingly, people often try to hide plague cases. If admitting that someone in your house has plague means your whole family will be locked in, maybe you tell people it's just a regular fever. Maybe you smuggle the sick person out to a friend's house. Maybe you bribe the watchman to let you slip out at night. These attempts to evade quarantine, while understandable, probably help the disease spread. Let's drift ahead to the late 15th century. It's been almost 150 years since the Black Death first struck, and London has recovered somewhat. The population is growing again, reaching maybe 50,000 by 1500. The city is expanding beyond its old Roman walls. Suburbs are developing in areas like Southwark, across the river, and in the liberties outside the walls where city regulations don't apply. Plague is still around, but it's become almost routine. There are outbreaks in 1478, 1485, 1499. Each one kills hundreds or thousands, but life goes on. The city has adapted. There are now permanent positions for searchers of the dead, women, usually poor widows, who are employed to examine corpses and determine cause of death. Their job is to identify plague cases so authorities can track outbreaks. It's grim work and not particularly reliable. The searchers often lack any medical training, but it's a system. There are also parish clerks who maintain bills of mortality, weekly tallies of deaths in each parish, broken down by cause. These bills become an important tool for tracking plague outbreaks. If plague deaths start to rise in a particular parish, authorities know to take action. The bills of mortality will continue for centuries, providing historians with incredibly valuable data about mortality patterns in London. As we move into the 16th century, London continues to grow, reaching perhaps 200,000 people by 1600. It's becoming a major European city, a centre of commerce, politics, and culture. The Tudor monarchs, Henry VI, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, preside over a period of relative prosperity and stability, at least compared to the chaos of the 15th century. But plague remains a constant threat. There are significant outbreaks in 1513, 1543, 1563, and 1593. The 1563 outbreak is particularly severe, killing perhaps 20,000 people, about a quarter of the city's population. That's the year William Shakespeare is born in Stratford-upon-Avon, and the plague is raging when he's just an infant. It's a reminder that for the Elizabethans, plague is just part of the background of life. Shakespeare's work is actually shot through with references to plague. The theatres often close during plague outbreaks. They're considered dangerous gathering places where the disease can spread, so as a playwright and actor, Shakespeare is directly affected by plague. He loses his son Hamnet in 1596, though probably not to plague, but the presence of death and disease permeates his plays. A plague on both your houses, Mercutio curses in Romeo and Juliet. The plague of Greece upon thee, thou mongrel, Ajax says in Troilus and Cressida. For Shakespeare's audience, these aren't abstract curses. They're invoking a real, present danger. The late 16th century also sees important developments in public health, or at least attempts at public health. The city authorities become more organized in their response to plague. They establish pest houses, hospitals specifically for plague patients, usually located outside the city walls. If you're diagnosed with plague, you might be forcibly removed from your home and taken to a pest house. This is meant to isolate the infected and protect the healthy, But pest houses are terrible places, overcrowded, unsanitary, with minimal medical care. Going to a pest house is often seen as a death sentence. There are also efforts to clean up the city. Laws are passed requiring residents to sweep the streets in front of their houses. Efforts are made to control the population of pigs, dogs, and rats. Butchers are ordered not to dump offal in the streets. These measures are inconsistently enforced and probably not very effective, but they show a growing recognition that urban cleanliness might be connected to disease, even if people don't understand the exact mechanisms. As the 17th century dawns, London is entering what will be its most plague-ridden period. The Stuart monarchs, James I and then Charles I, will preside over a city that experiences repeated, devastating outbreaks. There's a serious epidemic in 1603, right at the start of James's reign, killing 30,000. Another in 1625, killing 35,000. These are huge numbers, and they create a climate of constant anxiety. People start to think of plague as almost a seasonal phenomenon, like flu season today. Plague outbreaks tend to peak in the summer and autumn, when the weather is warm and flea populations are highest, and then decline in winter. So every summer there's a question, will plague come this year? How bad will it be? The wealthy develop the habit of leaving London every summer, even in years when there's no plague, just to be safe. This creates a social calendar where the season in London runs from autumn to spring, and then the gentry decamp to their country estates for the summer. If you've ever wondered why the English upper classes have this tradition of country houses where they spend part of the year, plague is part of the answer. For the poor who can't afford to flee, summer becomes a time of dread. You wake up every morning wondering if this is the day you'll feel that first fever, that first swelling. You watch your neighbors anxiously for signs of illness. You avoid crowds. You carry your pomander. You pray. And then, after centuries of this, after living with plague as a constant presence for 300 years, London faces its ultimate plague outbreak, the Great Plague of 1665. Are you still drifting along with me through this story? I hope you're finding this journey through history as fascinating as I do. If you're enjoying this deep dive, go ahead and hit that like button and drop a comment letting me know what you think. Should I make more content like this? What other historical disasters should I cover? Your feedback helps me create the content you want to hear. Now let's enter the year 1665. London's population has grown to perhaps 500,000 people. It's by far the largest city in England and one of the great cities of Europe, but it's also crowded, dirty, and ripe for disease. Most people still live in timber-framed houses that date back a century or more. The streets are narrow and filthy. There's still no proper sewage system. Rats are everywhere. It's a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The first cases of plague appear in the spring of 1665 in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, a poor neighbourhood outside the city walls. At first, it seems like just another minor outbreak, a few cases, nothing to panic about, but it doesn't stop. As the weather warms, the cases multiply. By June, the weekly bills of mortality show hundreds of plague deaths. By July, thousands. This is clearly not a minor outbreak. This is the big one, the outbreak people have feared for decades. Panic sets in. Those who can afford to flee do so immediately. King Charles II leaves London in July, taking his court to Oxford. The wealthy follow, abandoning the city to the poor and the unlucky. It's estimated that perhaps a quarter of London's population flees, but that still leaves several 100,000 people in the city, trapped by poverty or necessity. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, is one of those who stays. As a naval administrator, he feels duty-bound to remain at his post. His diary entries from 1665 provide a vivid day-by-day account of what it's like to live through the Great Plague. In June, he writes about seeing houses shut up, with red crosses on their doors. In July, he notes that he's starting to see plague victims in the streets, and hearing the constant rumble of death carts at night. By August, he's writing that the plague has got to that height that people's mouths are open against the magistrates for sending the sick to the pest house, and he's clearly frightened, though trying to keep calm. The measures taken to control the plague are more severe than in earlier outbreaks. Whole streets are shut down when multiple houses have cases. Watchmen are posted on every affected street to enforce quarantine. If you're locked in your house, you're not allowed to leave for any reason. Food and supplies are supposed to be brought to you, but the system is chaotic and sometimes breaks down. People starve while locked in their own homes, or die of plague while waiting for help that never comes. The pest houses overflow. New ones are established, but they can't keep up with demand. Mass graves are dug at multiple sites around the city. The most famous is at Aldgate, where a huge pit is excavated to receive hundreds of bodies. Night after night, the death carts roll through the streets, and men with muffled faces load corpses, calling out, "Bring out your dead." The city becomes a nightmare landscape. Shops are closed, their shutters painted with red crosses. Grass grows in the streets because there's so little traffic. The air is thick with the smell of death and the bonfires that are constantly burning. People believe that fire purifies the air. At night, the only sounds are the rumble of death carts, the cries of the dying, and the barking of dogs. Thousands of dogs and cats are killed during the outbreak. Authorities believe they might be spreading plague, which is tragically ironic because killing the city's cats probably makes the rat problem worse. The psychological toll is immense. People are exhausted, grieving, traumatized. Some drink themselves into oblivion. Some become recklessly brave, figuring they're dead anyway so might as well help others. Some turn religious, seeing the plague as God's judgment. Some turn selfish, hoarding food and barricading themselves inside their homes. And the death toll keeps rising. By September, the weekly bills of mortality show over 7,000 plague deaths per week. And that's just the official count. There are certainly many deaths that go unrecorded, especially among the poor. The total death toll for the outbreak is difficult to pin down, but most historians estimate somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 deaths. That's roughly 15 to 20% of London's population, gone in a single year. Samuel Pepys survives, though he loses friends and colleagues. His diary entries from September show him at his lowest point. He writes his will, convinced he's going to die. He moves his family out of the city. He contemplates what will happen to the nation if the plague doesn't stop. But then, as autumn turns to winter, something shifts. The weather cools, flea populations decline, the death rate begins to drop. By November, the weekly plague deaths are in the hundreds rather than thousands. By December, they're in the dozens. By January 1666, the Great Plague is essentially over. The worst outbreak in London's history has passed. The survivors return. Charles II comes back to London. The court reconvenes, Parliament meets, commerce resumes, and people begin the long, painful process of rebuilding their lives. So many families have lost members, so many businesses have failed, so much trauma to process. But London doesn't get much time to recover, because in September 1666, less than a year after the plague ends, the Great Fire of London breaks out. A small fire in a bakery on Pudding Lane spreads through the crowded timber-built city, burning for 4 days and destroying huge swathes of medieval London. Over 13,000 houses are destroyed, along with 87 churches and St. Paul's Cathedral. It's a disaster on top of a disaster, but oddly, the fire might have had some benefits. It destroys many of the old, rat-infested buildings where plague thrived. The rebuilding of London over the next few years uses more brick and stone, wider streets, better sanitation. The new London is less hospitable to plague. And in fact, the Great Plague of 1665 turns out to be the last major plague outbreak in London. There are small outbreaks in 1667 and 1668, but nothing like before. And then, plague essentially disappears from England. Nobody at the time understands why. The germ theory of disease is still 2 centuries away, but we can speculate. The Great Fire certainly helps by destroying plague-friendly housing. The introduction of brown rats, which gradually replaced black rats in England over the late 17th and early 18th centuries, might be a factor. Brown rats are less likely to live in close proximity to humans. Improvements in housing quality, gradual urbanization changes, quarantine measures that are actually enforced, all of these probably contribute. But here's the really interesting thing: plague doesn't disappear from everywhere. It continues to ravage other parts of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia for decades after it vanishes from England. There's a massive outbreak in Marseille, France in 1720 that kills 100,000 people. Plague continues to cause epidemics in the Ottoman Empire throughout the 18th century. In India and China, plague outbreaks continue into the 20th century. So why does London get spared? Why does England get spared? Historians still debate this. Some argue it's just dumb luck, that the particular strain of plague circulating in England dies out and is never reintroduced. Others point to specific policy changes or environmental factors. The truth is probably a combination of many things, and we may never know the full answer. What we do know is that for Londoners in the late 17th century, the disappearance of plague must have seemed like a miracle. After living under that shadow for 3 centuries, after losing family members to outbreak after outbreak, imagine the gradual realization that it's really gone. The summer comes and there's no plague. Next summer, same thing. A decade passes, a generation, and slowly the constant fear begins to fade. Plague becomes history rather than current events. By the 18th century, Londoners look back on the plague years the way we might look back on World War II, something our grandparents lived through, terrible and important but not an immediate threat. The city's population surges, reaching 575,000 by 1700 and 1 million by 1800. London becomes the largest city in the world, the capital of a global empire. The physical scars of plague fade as the city is rebuilt and expanded. The mass grave are built over, the pest houses are demolished, the last of the quarantine laws are repealed, but the memory lingers in strange ways. The nursery rhyme Ring Around the Rosy, which some people claim is about plague symptoms, though historians dispute this. The phrase to avoid something like the plague, meaning to stay far away from something dangerous. The concept of quarantine itself, which originates in plague control measures. And the medical knowledge gained from centuries of dealing with plague, while based on incorrect theories, did contribute to the development of public health as a field. The bills of mortality collected during plague years are some of the earliest systematic health data we have. The concept of isolating the sick to protect the healthy, while imperfectly implemented, is a sound principle. The recognition that urban cleanliness matters for health, even if people didn't understand germ theory, was important. If you're still listening, still drifting through this long history with me, I want to say thank you. Creating these deep historical narratives takes a lot of research and time, and your support means everything. If you haven't already subscribed to Dreamless Timelines, now's the perfect moment. Click that button, turn on notifications, and join us for more journeys into the past. And please leave a comment. What did you think of this story? What should I cover next? Now let's bring our story full circle and think about what the plague years meant for London and for history more broadly. The plague shaped London in profound ways. Economically, it accelerated the breakdown of feudalism. The labour shortages after the Black Death gave workers more bargaining power, which over time contributed to the rise of a money-based economy and greater social mobility. Peasants who had been tied to the land gained freedom. Cities became more important as centres of trade and manufacture. Culturally, the plague influenced art, literature, and philosophy. The omnipresence of death in medieval and early modern life shows up everywhere in the culture of the period. Dance of death imagery, where skeletons mingle with people of all social classes, becomes popular. Memento mori, remember you must die, becomes a common theme in art and writing. There's a certain gallows humor, a recognition that death can come at any moment, so you might as well live while you can. Religiously, the plague had complex effects. On one hand, it drove people to greater piety, to prayer and repentance. Churches were packed during outbreaks. On the other hand, the plague raised troubling questions. Why would a benevolent God allow such suffering? Why do the righteous die alongside sinners? These questions didn't lead to mass abandonment of faith. Medieval and early modern Europe was too thoroughly Christian for that, but they did create space for religious doubt and questioning that would eventually contribute to the Reformation and Enlightenment. Scientifically, the plague years were frustrating. Physicians tried everything they could think of: bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayer, amulets, special diets, but nothing worked reliably. This failure must have been humbling. It demonstrated the limits of medieval medicine and, over time, helped motivate the search for better approaches. The scientific revolution of the 17th century, with its emphasis on observation, experimentation, and evidence, developed partly in response to the inadequacy of traditional learning in the face of real-world problems like plague. The discovery of the actual cause of plague wouldn't come until 1894, when Alexander Yersin, a French bacteriologist working in Hong Kong during an outbreak there, identified the bacterium responsible and named it Pasteurella pestis, later renamed Yersinia pestis in his honor. Finally, after thousands of years of plague epidemics, humanity understood what was actually causing them. And a few years later, in 1898, Paul-Louis Simon demonstrated that fleas were the vector, transmitting the bacteria from rats to humans. Everything suddenly made sense: why plague was associated with rats, why it spread the way it did, why it occurred in certain conditions. This knowledge led to effective public health measures: rat control programs, flea control, proper quarantine of infected individuals, and eventually antibiotics, which can cure plague if administered early enough. Today, plague still exists, it's never been eradicated, and there are a few thousand cases worldwide each year, mostly in rural areas of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. But it's no longer the civilization-threatening terror it once was. We understand it, we can treat it. We can prevent it. For London specifically, the plague years from 1348 to 1665 represented a defining struggle, a 3-century battle against an invisible enemy that killed perhaps a third of the city's population across multiple outbreaks. The people who lived through those years displayed remarkable resilience, continuing to build, to create, to love and raise families even in the shadow of death. Think about what it means to live with that kind of threat. Today we've experienced pandemics, we know what it's like to worry about disease, to modify our behavior, to lose people we love. But imagine if that pandemic lasted not 2 years, but 300 years. Imagine if every generation of your family, going back 10 or 12 generations, had lost members to the same disease. That's what plague was for Londoners. And yet life went on. People fell in love, they had children, they built businesses, they created art and music and literature. They found moments of joy and beauty amid the horror. That's the human spirit for you. We're astonishingly good at adapting to even the worst circumstances and finding reasons to keep going. Let me take you deeper now into some of the personal stories from the plague years, because while the statistics are important, the numbers of dead, the percentages of population lost, what really brings history alive are the individual human experiences. There's a story from the Black Death about a woman named Joan of Kent, who would later become the Princess of Wales, mother of King Richard II. In 1348, when she's about 20 years old and the plague is ravaging England, Joan is living in comfortable circumstances as a member of the nobility. She's already been married twice, both marriages scandalous for different reasons. She's a bit of a rebel. When the plague strikes, Joan loses her mother to the disease. The grief is profound, but Joan survives and goes on to have a remarkable life, influencing English politics for decades. Her story is a reminder that plague didn't discriminate. It killed nobles and peasants alike, though the wealthy at least had the option to flee. During the 1563 outbreak, there's an account of a family in the parish of St. Giles Cripplegate. The father, a tailor, falls ill first. His wife nurses him until he dies, then she falls ill. Their teenage daughter takes care of her mother, watching her die over the course of 3 agonizing days. Then the daughter gets sick. She's all alone in the house now, her whole family dead. She manages to stagger to the window and call for help. A neighbor, showing enormous courage, enters the house and finds her dying. The girl pleads with the neighbor to make sure she's buried properly, not just thrown in a plague pit. The neighbor promises and keeps that promise, paying for a proper burial out of her own meager funds. Both the tragedy and the compassion in this story are very moving. And then there's the famous story from the Great Plague of the village of Iam in Derbyshire. While not in London, it's connected to the London outbreak. In 1665, a box of cloth is sent from London to Iam. The cloth is infected with plague fleas. When the box is opened, the village tailor becomes sick and dies. The plague begins to spread through the village. The local rector, William Mompesson, makes a remarkable decision. He convinces the villagers to quarantine themselves, to not flee the village and potentially spread the plague to surrounding areas. For over a year, the people of Iam isolate themselves. Food and supplies are left at the village boundaries. Families bury their own dead. By the time the plague burns itself out, about half the village is dead, but they succeeded in containing the outbreak. It's one of the most powerful examples of community sacrifice in history. Back in London during that same 1665 outbreak, there's a doctor named Nathaniel Hodges who, unlike many of his colleagues, stays in the city to treat plague patients. He works tirelessly, visiting dozens of patients each day despite the obvious danger. He writes about his experiences in a book called L'Homologue, published a few years later. Hodges describes his daily routine, rising early, fortifying himself with some wine and a bit of food, then making his rounds through the plague-stricken city. He treats rich and poor alike, often waiving fees for those who can't pay. He describes the symptoms he observes in detail: the buboes, the fever, the delirium. He tries various treatments, most of them useless by modern standards, but he's genuinely trying to help. Hodges survives the plague, though he's weakened by his exertions and dies a few years later, possibly from the long-term effects of repeated exposure. He's a hero, one of many who risked and sometimes gave their lives to help others during the plague years. There's also the story of the Searchers of the Dead I mentioned earlier. These were women, usually poor widows, who were hired to examine corpses and determine cause of death. It was dangerous, low-status work, but it paid, and for women with few other options, it was a way to survive. The searchers would be called to a house where someone had died. They'd examine the body, looking for the telltale signs of plague, the buboes, the discoloration. Then they'd report to the parish clerk, who would record the death in the bills of mortality. The searchers were often suspected of being incompetent or corrupt. People accused them of misidentifying plague deaths, either because they didn't know what they were looking at, or because they'd been bribed by families who didn't want their house to be shut up. There was probably some truth to these accusations. The searchers weren't trained medical professionals, but they were doing an important job under terrible conditions, and many of them died of plague contracted during their work. One account from 1625 describes a searcher named Margaret who examined over 200 plague victims during that year's outbreak. She survived remarkably, though she lost her daughter to the disease. Margaret continued working as a searcher for years afterward, becoming something of an expert. The parish relied on her judgment. She was paid a small stipend, barely enough to live on, but she took pride in her work. She believed she was serving her community, helping to track and contain the plague. Whether her efforts actually made a difference is debatable, but her dedication is admirable. Let me also tell you about the plague doctors, those iconic figures in their beaked masks. The costume was designed by a French physician named Charles Delorme in 1619. The long beak was filled with aromatic substances, herbs, spices, camphor, rose petals, the idea being that these pleasant smells would protect against the miasma believed to cause plague. The doctors also wore long wax coats, gloves, boots, and hats, covering themselves completely. They carried canes to examine patients without touching them directly. The costume is creepy and fascinating in equal measure. Those beaked masks look like something from a nightmare. And indeed, for many plague victims, the arrival of a plague doctor, looking like some strange bird creature, must have been terrifying. But the doctors were trying to help, using the best knowledge available at the time. The effectiveness of the costume is questionable. It might have provided some protection against flea bites, simply by covering more of the body. But the doctors still got sick and died at high rates. The job was incredibly dangerous, and only those who were desperate for money or extraordinarily dedicated would take it on. Now, as we drift further into this narrative, let me paint you a more detailed picture of what a plague house looked like, what it was like to be shut up inside with infected family members, because this is where the horror of plague really hits home, in the intimate spaces of people's lives. Imagine a typical London house in 1665. It's narrow, maybe just 15 feet wide, squeezed between similar houses on either side. The ground floor has a shop, let's say it's a baker's shop with living quarters behind. Upper floors have bedrooms. The family lives here, parents and several children, maybe a servant or two if they're doing okay financially. They share beds, 2 or 3 people to a bed. Privacy is minimal. The house is dim, lit by candles, and whatever daylight comes through small windows. It's summer, so it's hot and stuffy. One morning, the father wakes up feeling feverish. By afternoon, he's in bed, too weak to stand. He has a terrible headache, his body aches, and he's starting to develop a swelling in his groin. The family knows what this means. Plague. Terror sets in. They send for a doctor who confirms the diagnosis. Within hours, the authorities arrive. They paint a red cross on the door 3 feet high with the words, "Lord have mercy upon us," above it. A watchman is posted outside. The family is told they cannot leave for 40 days. Food will be brought to them, they're assured, but they must stay inside. So now you're locked in this small house with a dying man. You're his wife, let's say. You have 4 children, ranging from a baby to a 10-year-old. You have to care for your husband, who's deteriorating rapidly. The buboes are agonizingly painful. He's delirious with fever, calling out, not making sense. You try to keep the children calm, but they're scared. They've seen other families go through this. They know what happens. 2 days later, your husband dies. You're overwhelmed with grief, but you can't even bury him properly. Men come and take the body away. You don't know where they take it. You just know he's gone. Now you wait while the rest of you get sick. You watch the children obsessively for any sign of fever. You check yourself constantly. Every ache, every momentary feeling of warmth could be the start. The days drag on. Food is left outside the door by the watchman. You're running low on firewood. The house is a mess. You're exhausted, grieving, terrified. On day 5 of your quarantine, your oldest child, the 10-year-old, starts feeling sick. No, you think, no, but yes, the fever rises, the buboes appear. You nurse your child as you nursed your husband, but you know how this ends. 3 days later, your child is dead. Men come and take this body too. Now you're really falling apart. You've lost your husband and your eldest child. You still have 3 more children to protect. The baby won't stop crying. You're barely eating. You're not sleeping. You're just existing in this nightmare, trapped in this house, waiting to see if death will take more of you. This is what quarantine meant in 1665. This was the reality for thousands of London families. Some survived intact, some lost everyone. It was brutal, inhumane in many ways, but authorities felt they had no choice. If plague-infected families were allowed to move freely, the disease would spread even faster. Many people tried to escape quarantine. There are accounts of families bribing watchmen, or sneaking out at night, or breaking through walls into neighboring houses that weren't locked up. The desperation was understandable, but every escape potentially spread the disease further. If you're finding this story gripping, if you're learning things you never knew about the plague, do me a favor and let me know in the comments below. What's the most surprising thing you've learned so far? And if you're not already subscribed to Dreamless Timelines, what are you waiting for? Hit that button and join us for more deep dives into history. Let's shift our focus now to the economic and social impacts of plague, because beyond the immediate horror of sickness and death, the plague transformed London's economy and society in fundamental ways. Before the Black Death, England was a feudal society. Most people were peasants who worked land owned by nobles. They owed labour service to their lords and had very limited freedom. They couldn't leave the manor without permission. They couldn't marry without permission. Their lives were tightly controlled. This system worked, more or less, as long as there was a surplus of labour. Lords could always find workers, so they had no incentive to pay wages or offer better conditions. The Black Death destroyed this system by killing off such a huge portion of the workforce. Suddenly, there weren't enough workers to farm all the land. Lords found themselves competing for labourers, and labourers, realising they had leverage, started demanding higher wages and better conditions. If a lord refused, workers would just go somewhere else. The English government tried to prevent this with laws like the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But it was futile. You can't legislate against market forces. Workers continued to demand and receive higher pay. Many left the land entirely and moved to cities like London, where opportunities were better. The old feudal bonds weakened and eventually broke. This created tremendous social mobility. Families that had been poor for generations could improve their circumstances. Younger sons who wouldn't have inherited land could now make good livings as laborers or craftsmen. Women, who had been relegated to the lowest paying work, found better opportunities in the labor shortage. There's an interesting economic principle at work here, one that would be studied by historians and economists for centuries. A massive reduction in population doesn't just scale everything down proportionally, it actually changes the fundamental relationships in society. When there's abundant land but not enough workers, labor becomes valuable, workers gain power, income inequality decreases, at least for a while, living standards for common people improve. This happened after the Black Death and continued in varying degrees through the later plague outbreaks. Each wave of plague removed more workers, maintaining the labor shortage. Real wages in England increased substantially between 1350 and 1500. Diets improved, people ate more meat, which had been a luxury before. Housing improved. Ordinary people owned more possessions, better clothes, simple furniture, kitchenware. Of course, this wasn't universal. Some people remained desperately poor, and the plague itself was a horror that outweighed any economic benefit. But it's fascinating how death on such a massive scale could paradoxically improve conditions for the survivors. The plague also affected London's physical development. After each major outbreak, there was a period of rebuilding. Vacant properties were absorbed or torn down. Neighborhoods were reconfigured. Over time, this led to changes in the city's layout and character. The Great Fire of 1666, coming right after the Great Plague, provided an opportunity for even more dramatic change. When London was rebuilt, it was done with more attention to public health, wider streets, stone and brick buildings instead of timber, better water supplies. The new London was cleaner and more orderly, if also less charming than the old medieval city. Culturally, the plague years produced some remarkable art and literature, often dealing with themes of death, suffering, and the fragility of life. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became a popular artistic motif across Europe. These were paintings, woodcuts, and even performances showing death personified as a skeleton leading people of all social classes in a dance. The message was that death comes for everyone, rich or poor, young or old, and you'd better be prepared. There's a famous series of Dance of Death woodcuts by Hans Holbein the Younger, created in the 1520s, showing death interrupting people at every stage and station of life. There's death coming for the Pope, for the Emperor, for the merchant, for the ploughman. The images are darkly humorous in some ways, but also deeply sobering. They reflect a society that lived intimately with death, that saw it not as an abstract future event, but as a constant present possibility. In literature, the plague influenced works like Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the Black Death in Italy, where a group of young people flee Florence and entertain each other with stories while waiting for the plague to pass. There's Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the aftermath of plague outbreaks in England, with its vivid cast of characters from all levels of society. There's Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1722, but set during the 1665 outbreak, a novelized but historically researched account of life during the Great Plague. These works give us windows into how people thought and felt during the plague years. They show us the fear, yes, but also the resilience, the dark humor, the determination to keep living even in the face of death. Let me tell you about some of the stranger aspects of plague history, the things that seem almost unbelievable but are documented. There was a widespread belief during plague outbreaks that domestic animals, particularly cats and dogs, were spreading the disease. As a result, authorities ordered mass killings of these animals. In London during the 1665 outbreak, it's estimated that 40,000 dogs and perhaps 200,000 cats were killed. This was tragically counterproductive. Cats and dogs don't carry plague fleas that readily bite humans. You know what does carry those fleas? Rats. And you know what keeps rat populations under control? Cats. By killing all the cats, London basically removed one of its best natural defenses against plague. The rat population probably exploded, making the plague worse. But people didn't know that. They were operating on limited information and bad theories, trying anything that might help. It's easy to judge them from our vantage point of modern medical knowledge, but they were doing their best in impossible circumstances. There were also some truly bizarre attempted cures and preventatives. Some people believed that sitting in a room with a goat would protect them, the idea being that the goat would absorb the plague miasma. Others tried what was called the royal touch, believing that being touched by the king could cure disease. Charles II actually participated in this, touching thousands of people during his reign, though there's no evidence it cured anyone of anything. Some plague cures were dangerous in themselves. There's something called Venice treacle, or theriac, a supposed universal antidote that had been used since ancient times. It contained dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh, opium, and various herbs, all mixed with honey. It probably didn't help with plague, but the opium at least would have eased pain. Other remedies involved ingesting mercury or arsenic, both of which are toxic and likely killed patients who might have otherwise survived. Then there were the plague water recipes, concoctions of herbs, flowers, and spices steeped in alcohol. These were drunk or applied to the skin as preventatives. They wouldn't have done anything against plague, but they might have had a mild antiseptic effect, and at the very least, they gave people a sense of taking action, of not being completely helpless. Speaking of not being helpless, let's talk about the people who actually did try to understand plague scientifically, as much as was possible given the state of medical knowledge. There were doctors who kept careful records of plague cases, noting symptoms, treatments attempted, and outcomes. These early epidemiologists, though they wouldn't have used that term, were laying the groundwork for modern public health. One of the most interesting figures is John Graunt, who in 1662 published a book called Natural and Political Observations Made upon the Bills of Mortality. Graunt analysed decades of London's death records, looking for patterns. He was one of the first people to use statistical methods to study health and disease. He calculated death rates, identified seasonal patterns, compared mortality between parishes, and tried to estimate London's population based on death records. Graunt's work on plague is particularly interesting. He noticed that plague deaths followed certain patterns. They peaked in late summer and fall, they were higher in crowded parishes, they affected people of all ages but seemed especially deadly for the poor. He didn't understand why exactly, but he was asking the right questions, the kind of empirical, data-driven questions that would eventually lead to real understanding. Another important figure is Thomas Sydenham, sometimes called the English Hippocrates, who practiced medicine in London during and after the 1665 plague. Sydenham was an advocate for careful observation and empirical treatment. He kept detailed notes on his patients, tried to classify diseases based on symptoms, and argued against many of the traditional treatments that he believed did more harm than good. Sydenham didn't solve plague, but his approach, emphasizing observation over theory, was an important step toward modern medicine. He influenced generations of physicians who came after him. Now I want to take you inside a plague doctor's day to really understand what they experienced. It's 1665, late summer, the height of the Great Plague. You're a physician who has stayed in London despite the danger. Maybe you stayed because you felt a duty to help. Maybe you stayed because you needed the money. Plague duty pays well because it's so dangerous. Maybe some combination of both. You wake before dawn in your lodgings. You live alone now, your family evacuated to the countryside. You eat a small breakfast, bread and ale, maybe some cold meat. You don't want a heavy meal. The work ahead is exhausting and you might not get another chance to eat until evening. You put on your plague doctor costume, the long wax coat that covers you from neck to ankles, the leather gloves that reach your elbows, the boots, the wide-brimmed hat, and finally the mask, that strange beaked thing that makes you look like a monstrous bird. Inside the beak you've stuffed a mixture of aromatic substances, dried roses, cloves, cinnamon, myrrh. The smell is overwhelming at first, but you get used to it. It's better than the smells you'll encounter on your rounds. You pick up your cane, a long wooden stick that you'll use to examine patients without touching them directly. Everything you might need is in the pockets of your coat: small packets of herbs, a bottle of vinegar for disinfecting, a notebook and pen for recording cases. You step out into the London morning. The streets are nearly empty, very different from the usual bustle. The few people you pass give you a wide berth. Your costume marks you as a plague doctor, and while some are grateful for your service, others see you as a harbinger of death and want nothing to do with you. Your first call is to a house in Cheapside, a prosperous merchant family, or they were prosperous before plague shut down their business. The father is sick. You're ushered in by a distraught wife. The patient is in bed, clearly in the later stages of plague. His fever is raging, his buboes are huge and blackened. There's a terrible smell. You examine him from a distance, using your cane to lift blankets to check pulse and respiration. You make notes. You recommend treatments, poultices for the buboes, herbal drafts to reduce fever, but you know they probably won't help. This man is dying. You try to be kind, to offer some comfort to his family, but you can't lie to them about his chances. Next, call a tenement in the slums. 5 people crammed into a single room. 2 are dead already, their bodies lying where they fell because nobody has come to collect them yet. 2 more are sick, showing early symptoms. The 5th, a teenage girl, seems healthy so far but is clearly terrified. You do what you can, which isn't much. You arrange for the bodies to be collected. You examine the sick. You give the girl some advice: keep clean, avoid the sick if possible, pray. It's inadequate, and you know it. The day continues like this, house after house, patient after patient, most are poor. living in terrible conditions that make plague even more deadly. Some are better off, but plague doesn't care about wealth. You see children dying, old people, young mothers, strong men in their prime. You see grief and fear everywhere. By mid-afternoon, you're exhausted. The heat inside your protective costume is stifling. Your legs ache from climbing stairs and walking miles through the city. Your throat is dry from breathing through the herb-stuffed beak. But there are more calls, more people who need help, so you keep going. Evening finally comes. You return to your lodgings. You strip off your costume carefully, not touching the outside surfaces any more than necessary. You wash thoroughly with vinegar and water. You eat a meal, but you're too tired to taste it. You make notes on the day's cases, recording symptoms and treatments, adding to the data that might someday help future doctors understand this disease. Then you sleep fitfully, plagued by nightmares of the day's sights, the dying faces, the desperate families, the overwhelming sense of helplessness in the face of so much death. And tomorrow you'll do it all again, and the day after, and the day after, until the plague finally breaks or until you yourself fall ill. It's brutal, grinding work. Many plague doctors don't survive more than a few weeks, but you keep going because people need help, and you're one of the few willing to provide it. That's what it meant to be a plague doctor in 1665. Heroes, every one of them, working with inadequate knowledge and tools, but never giving up. You're still here with me, still journeying through this long history. I appreciate you sticking with this story. If you're enjoying these deep historical narratives, make sure you're subscribed to Dreamless Timelines so you never miss an episode. And hey, give this video a thumbs up if you're finding it interesting and informative. Your engagement really helps the channel grow. Now, let's explore what happened after the plague ended in London, how the city and its people dealt with the aftermath, and how the memory of plague shaped English society for generations. When the Great Plague finally subsided in early 1666, London faced massive challenges. Tens of thousands were dead, businesses had collapsed, families were broken. The psychological trauma was immense, but life had to go on. The city had to be rebuilt, not just physically, though the Great Fire would soon necessitate literal rebuilding, but socially and economically. One of the first tasks was dealing with the practical matters of all those deaths. Property ownership had to be sorted out. When an entire family died who inherited their house, their business, their possessions, the courts were flooded with inheritance cases. Some properties stayed vacant for years because nobody could figure out who the rightful owner was. There was also the matter of unpaid debts and unfulfilled contracts. If a merchant had agreed to deliver goods but died of plague before completing the contract, was his estate liable? If someone owed money but died, could the debt be collected from their heirs? These kinds of questions kept lawyers busy for years. For the survivors, there was grief to process. Almost everyone had lost family members, friends, neighbors. Some people had lost spouses and children, losing their entire families. The trauma was profound. There were no therapists, no grief counselors, no support groups. People had to cope on their own or with the help of their church and community. Many turned to religion, seeing their survival as God's providence and dedicating themselves to lives of greater piety. Others became more cynical, questioning why God would allow such suffering. Some developed a kind of survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when so many others died. The economic recovery took time but eventually happened. The labor shortage created by plague deaths meant that survivors, especially those in working-class occupations, could command higher wages. Apprentices who survived could quickly rise to become masters of their trades, since so many senior craftsmen had died. Servants could demand better pay and conditions. This led to another round of social mobility, similar to what happened after the Black Death. Families that had been struggling improved their circumstances. The rigid social hierarchy loosened a bit. It wasn't a revolution. England was still very much a class-based society, but there was more fluidity than before. London's population recovered surprisingly quickly. People from rural areas migrated to the city, attracted by economic opportunities. Refugees from the plague who had fled to the countryside returned. By the 1670s, London's population was growing again, and by the end of the century, it had surpassed pre-plague levels. The city that emerged from the plague years was different in subtle ways. There was a greater emphasis on public health. The bills of mortality continued to be published, and people paid attention to them. There were efforts, however limited, to improve sanitation. The rebuilding after the Great Fire created a cleaner, more orderly city. There was also a shift in attitudes toward disease and medicine. The plague had demonstrated the inadequacy of traditional medical theory. While it would be decades before the germ theory of disease emerged, there was a growing sense that empirical observation and experimentation were more useful than relying on ancient texts. This was part of the broader scientific revolution happening in the 17th century, exemplified by figures like Robert Boyle, Robert Hooke, and Isaac Newton. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, became a forum for discussing and investigating natural phenomena, including disease. While they didn't solve plague, they established a new way of approaching scientific questions that would eventually lead to real breakthroughs. Politically, the plague years had interesting effects. The temporary disruption of normal government functions during outbreaks showed both the fragility of political systems and their resilience. When King Charles II fled London during the Great Plague, there was some grumbling, but no serious challenge to royal authority. The government continued to function, if imperfectly. The plague also affected England's relationship with other countries. English merchants trading overseas faced quarantine restrictions when plague was active in London. Ships from London were turned away from foreign ports or subjected to lengthy quarantines. This hurt trade and gave English merchants a reason to support better plague control measures. Within England, the plague influenced relations between London and the rest of the country. Provincial cities were wary of accepting refugees from plague-stricken London, fearing they would bring disease with them. This created tensions that persisted even after plague ended. The memory of plague lingered in English culture for generations. Even after plague ceased to be an active threat, people remembered the terror of the plague years. Stories were passed down through families. Plague pits and emergency burial grounds remained as landmarks. Buildings that had been plague houses bore the mark of their history. Literary and artistic depictions of plague continued long after the disease itself vanished. Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1722, kept the memory of 1665 alive. Gothic literature of the 18th and 19th centuries often featured plague as a plot element, using it as a symbol of death and decay. In public health, plague remained a reference point. When new diseases emerged, they were compared to plague. When cholera struck London in the 19th century, authorities remembered the plague and implemented similar control measures: quarantine, disinfection, public health warnings. Some of these measures were effective, though often for different reasons than people thought at the time. The concept of quarantine itself, which had been developed largely in response to plague, became a standard tool of public health and remains so today. The idea of isolating the sick to protect the healthy, of restricting travel during epidemics, of tracking disease cases, these all came out of the centuries of fighting plague. Interestingly, England's experience with plague, and particularly the fact that it ended while continuing elsewhere, may have influenced British attitudes toward public health and disease control. There was a sense that England had figured something out, whether through divine favor or superior practices. This somewhat smug attitude would persist into the 19th century. Now let's talk about the rats, because they're the key to understanding why plague behaved the way it did, even though people at the time didn't know it. Rats were everywhere in medieval and early modern London. They lived in the walls of houses, in cellars and attics, in the thatch of roofs, in warehouses and stables. They fed on stored grain, on garbage, on anything edible they could find. And where there are rats, there are fleas. The black rat, Rattus rattus, is the primary host for Xenopsila chiopes, the oriental rat flea, which is the main vector for plague. These fleas live on rats, feeding on their blood. When a rat is infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacteria multiply in the flea's gut until they block its digestive tract. The flea becomes desperate for blood and bites frantically, regurgitating bacteria into each bite wound. If the rat host dies of plague, the fleas jump to another rat. But if rat populations crash because plague is killing them, the fleas will jump to other animals, including humans. This is why plague outbreaks often followed a pattern. First, rats would die, lots of rats. People might notice dead rats in the streets in their homes, but they probably didn't connect this to the coming plague. Then a week or two later, human cases would start appearing. The fleas, having lost their rat hosts, were biting humans, transmitting plague in the process. The seasonal pattern of plague, peaking in summer and fall, declining in winter, makes perfect sense when you understand the flea connection. Fleas thrive in warm weather. Their populations boom in summer. In winter, cold temperatures reduce flea activity and reproduction. This is why plague outbreaks almost always followed the same seasonal pattern. The connection between rats, fleas, and plague wasn't understood until the late 19th century, but once it was discovered, everything suddenly made sense. All the observations about plague that people had accumulated over centuries, the seasonal patterns, the association with dirty, crowded conditions, the way it seemed to spread through neighborhoods, all of it fit perfectly with a rat-flea-human transmission cycle. This knowledge revolutionized plague control. Instead of praying or burning aromatic woods or shutting people up in their homes, public health authorities could focus on the actual source of the problem. Rat control programs, improved sanitation to reduce rat populations, insecticides to kill fleas. These measures actually worked. In the early 20th century, when plague outbreaks occurred in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, Authorities used rat control as their primary weapon, and it was effective. They didn't eliminate plague entirely. It persists in wild rodent populations to this day, but they prevented major epidemics. The story of how plague was finally understood, after causing suffering for thousands of years, is one of the great achievements of medical science. It involved researchers from multiple countries, working over decades, gradually piecing together the puzzle. The identification of the bacterium by Yersin in 1894, the discovery of flea transmission by Simond in 1898, the recognition of different forms of plague, bubonic, pneumonic, septicemic. The development of antibiotics in the mid-20th century that could actually cure plague. Each step built on the previous ones, and together they transformed plague from an unstoppable apocalypse to a treatable disease. But back in London in the 17th and 18th centuries, nobody knew any of this. They just knew that plague had been a constant terror for 300 years, and then mysteriously it stopped. And they were grateful, even if they didn't fully understand why. Let me take you now into some specific neighborhoods of plague-era London, because the city wasn't uniform in its experience of plague. Different areas had different death rates, different social responses, different stories. The wealthy parishes in the west end of the city, places like St. James and Westminster, had lower death rates than the crowded eastern parishes like Stepney and Whitechapel. This was partly because wealthy people could flee, but also because their housing was better, less crowded, with fewer rats. The parish of St. Giles in the Fields, where the Great Plague started in 1665, was a poor area just outside the city walls. It was notorious for its slums, narrow alleys crammed with ramshackle houses where multiple families lived in single rooms. Sanitation was virtually non-existent, garbage piled in the streets. It was exactly the kind of environment where plague could take hold and spread rapidly. When plague appeared in St. Giles in the spring of 1665, authorities tried to contain it by shutting up infected houses and restricting movement in the parish. But it was too late. The disease had already spread into the city proper. By summer, plague was raging in parishes all across London. The eastern parishes, home to dock workers, sailors, and the labouring poor, were hit particularly hard. These areas were overcrowded, with housing that was often barely habitable. People lived in cellars, in attics, in sheds and outbuildings. Multiple families shared outdoor privies. Water came from communal wells that were often contaminated. These were ideal conditions for both rats and disease. The death toll in these eastern parishes was staggering. In some areas, half the population died. Entire streets were emptied. Houses stood vacant, their former inhabitants all dead. The survivors were traumatized, many of them having lost everyone they knew. In contrast, the western parishes, while not immune to plague, fared better. The housing was better quality. Wealthy residents fled early. Those who remained had resources to buy food without venturing to crowded markets. They could afford to hire servants to run errands, minimizing their own exposure. This disparity in plague mortality based on wealth and location is a theme that runs through all of London's plague history. The poor always suffered more. They couldn't flee. They lived in worse conditions. They had less access to medical care, such as it was. They worked in jobs that exposed them to infection. They died in greater numbers. And yet the plague didn't respect social boundaries entirely. Nobles died. Wealthy merchants died. Even royalty wasn't immune. Several members of the royal family died of plague over the centuries. But statistically, your chances of surviving plague were much better if you were wealthy. This reality shaped how plague was remembered and discussed. For the wealthy, plague was a terrible misfortune, a disaster to be fled. For the poor, it was a fact of life, something you endured because you had no choice. The different perspectives influenced policy. When authorities made decisions about plague control, they often prioritized protecting the wealthy and maintaining social order, even if that meant harsh measures for the poor, like forced quarantine. There's a class dimension to every aspect of the plague story that we shouldn't overlook. Who got to leave the city and who had to stay? Who got proper medical care and who was left to die? Who was buried decently and who was thrown in plague pits? Who had their story recorded and who was forgotten? Plague, like most disasters, revealed and exacerbated existing inequalities. Now let me take you inside one more specific story, a more hopeful one. It's the story of the village of Iam that I mentioned earlier, but I want to tell it in more detail because it's so remarkable. Iam is a small village in Derbyshire, in the north of England. In August 1665, a tailor named George Vicars receives a box of cloth from London. The cloth is damp, so he hangs it in front of the fire to dry. Within days, he's dead of plague. The cloth was infected with plague fleas. Plague begins to spread through the village. By the end of 1665, several people have died. The villagers are frightened. Many want to flee to nearby towns. But the rector, William Mompesson, realizes that if they flee, they'll spread plague to surrounding areas. He makes an extraordinary request. "Stay here," he says. "Quarantine the entire village. Contain the plague, even at the cost of your own lives." To his amazement, the villagers agree. They set up a boundary around the village that nobody will cross. Food and supplies are left at the boundary by people from neighboring villages. Payment is left in vinegar-filled water troughs. People believe vinegar disinfects coins. The Iam villagers pick up the supplies but don't have direct contact with outsiders. For over a year, they maintain this self-quarantine. Families bury their own dead. People can't gather for funerals because that might spread infection. Elizabeth Hancock loses her husband and 6 children in a single week. She buries them all herself in a field near her home. Imagine that grief. Imagine that strength. The village blacksmith, Marshall Howe, buries his wife and sons. The plague moves from house to house. Every day brings new deaths. The villagers must have been tempted to break quarantine to flee while they still could, but they don't. They keep their promise. William Mompesson loses his own wife to plague. Catherine Mompesson had volunteered to stay with her husband, though he had urged her to leave. She nursed the sick and comforted the dying until plague took her too. Mompesson buries her and continues his work, even though he must be devastated. By the time the plague finally burns out in November 1666, 260 of Iam's 350 residents are dead. 3/4 of the village gone, but the quarantine worked. Plague didn't spread to neighboring villages. The sacrifice of Iam's people saved countless lives in surrounding areas. The survivors slowly rebuild. The village continues, though deeply scarred by what happened. The story of Iam becomes famous, a testament to community sacrifice and moral courage. Today, there's a museum in Iam dedicated to this history. The plague cottages still stand. The grave of plague victims can be visited. It's a powerful reminder of both the horror of plague and the nobility of which humans are capable. Stories like Iam's give us hope when we look back at the plague years. Yes, there was horror. Yes, there was death and suffering on an unimaginable scale. But there was also courage, compassion, and sacrifice. There were people who stayed to help when they could have fled. People who risked their own lives to care for the sick. Communities that came together in crisis. This is the complicated truth about the plague years. They were the worst of times, but they also revealed the best in people. They tested humanity, and while many failed that test, many others passed it with flying colors. If you're still with me on this journey, thank you. We're deep into this story now, exploring every corner of London's plague history. If you're finding this valuable, if you're learning things you never knew, please hit that subscribe button for Dreamless Timelines. And leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What aspect of the plague story surprises you most? Let's talk now about the medical theories that people used to explain plague, because understanding how people thought about disease helps us understand their responses to it. Medieval and early modern medicine was based largely on the theories of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, particularly Hippocrates and Galen. The central concept was the theory of humours. According to this theory, the human body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on these humours being in proper balance. Disease occurred when the humours became imbalanced. Different diseases were associated with different types of imbalance. Treatment aimed to restore balance, often through bloodletting to remove excess blood, or through purging to remove excess bile. For plague specifically, physicians believed it was caused by a corruption of the air, a miasma. This miasma could come from various sources: rotting matter, swamps, volcanic eruptions, even unfavorable alignments of planets. When you breathed this corrupted air, it threw your humours out of balance, leading to plague. This theory actually made a certain amount of sense based on observable facts. Plague did seem to be associated with bad smells and dirty conditions. It did seem to spread through the air to some extent. Pneumonic plague actually does spread through airborne droplets, though the mechanism is different from what they thought. And the seasonal patterns of plague could be explained by seasonal changes in air quality. Based on this theory, physicians recommended various preventions and treatments. To avoid breathing bad air, you should carry aromatic substances, pomanders, nosegays of flowers, sachets of herbs. You should burn aromatic woods to purify the air in your house. You should avoid crowded places where the air is more likely to be corrupted. These recommendations, while based on incorrect theory, probably did provide some protection by encouraging people to avoid crowds and maintain some distance from the sick. For treatment, physicians used bloodletting, applying leeches or making cuts to drain blood. They used purges and enemas to clear the bowels. They applied poultices to buboes to try to draw out the corruption. They prescribed various herbal remedies. None of these treatments worked against plague, and bloodletting probably weakened patients and made them more likely to die, but physicians were sincerely trying to help based on the best knowledge they had. There were also religious explanations for plague. Many people believed plague was divine punishment for sin. This belief was powerful and shaped responses to plague in important ways. If plague was God's judgment, then the proper response was prayer, repentance, and religious devotion. Churches organized special services during plague outbreaks. People confessed their sins and vowed to live better lives if they survived. Some engaged in extreme acts of penance. The most dramatic example of this was the flagellant movement that emerged during the Black Death. Groups of men traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves to atone for humanity's sins. They believed that by taking on suffering voluntarily, they could appease God's wrath and end the plague. The movement became quite large in some parts of Europe before being suppressed by church authorities, who worried it was getting out of control. In England, flagellants were less common, but there were other expressions of religious fervor. People made pilgrimages to holy sites. They donated money to churches. They attended Mass more frequently. There were reports of visions and miracles during plague outbreaks, signs that people interpreted as messages from God. The combination of medical and religious explanations for plague created a complex framework for understanding the disease. Physicians focused on natural causes, corrupted air, imbalanced humors, while priests emphasized supernatural causes, divine judgment, demonic influence. Most people probably accepted both explanations. You could believe plague was caused by bad air and also believe it was God's punishment. The two weren't mutually exclusive. This dual framework influenced how people responded to plague. You might follow your physician's advice to carry aromatic herbs and avoid crowds, while also praying, confessing your sins, and making religious vows. You were covering your bases, both natural and supernatural. There were also folk beliefs about plague that existed alongside official medical and religious theories. Some people believed plague was spread by evil spirits or demons. There were charms and amulets supposedly offering protection. Some believed certain people could curse others with plague, leading to accusations of witchcraft during outbreaks. The Jewish community faced particular persecution during plague outbreaks, especially during the Black Death. Rumors spread that Jews were poisoning wells to cause plague, a completely false accusation based on anti-Semitic prejudice. These rumors led to horrific violence. Entire Jewish communities were massacred in some European cities. In England, the Jewish community had been expelled in 1290 and wouldn't be officially readmitted until the 1650s, so this particular horror was less common there, but it shows how fear of plague could unleash the worst human impulses. Outsiders in general were often blamed for bringing plague. Foreigners, travelers, beggars, any group that was already marginalized might be accused of spreading disease. This scapegoating served a psychological purpose. It gave people someone to blame, something concrete to focus their fear and anger on, but it was unjust and often led to violence against innocent people. The irony is that while people were blaming each other, while physicians were trying useless treatments, while priests were calling for repentance, the real cause of plague, bacteria being transmitted by fleas from rats, was right there, invisible and unsuspected. If only they'd had microscopes and germ theory, how many lives could have been saved? But we can't judge them too harshly for not knowing what they couldn't possibly know. Medical science had to develop step by step over centuries. Each generation built on the knowledge of previous generations. The physicians of the 17th century knew more than those of the 14th, even if they still didn't understand plague. The physicians of the 19th century knew more still, and we today benefit from all that accumulated knowledge. In a way, the plague years were part of the long education of humanity, a painful lesson that drove home the importance of understanding disease, that motivated the development of epidemiology and public health, that eventually led to modern medicine. The people who suffered and died from plague contributed, unwillingly, to that education. Their experiences, documented in bills of mortality and medical treatises and personal accounts, provided data that later scientists could study. There's something both tragic and hopeful about that. Tragic because so many died needlessly, because they could have been saved if only the knowledge existed. Hopeful because their suffering wasn't entirely meaningless. It led, eventually, to knowledge that has saved millions of lives since. Now, let's explore some of the daily realities of living in plague-time London in more detail. The small things that made life both harder and stranger. Consider something as simple as going to the market to buy food. In normal times, the markets of London were vibrant, crowded places. Vendors called out their wares, people bargained and gossiped. It was a social experience as much as a commercial one. During plague outbreaks, markets became places of fear. You needed food, so you had to go, but every trip carried risk. Who had touched that loaf of bread before you? Was that vendor coughing? Is that person across from you showing signs of fever? You tried to complete your business quickly and get out. You avoided touching people. You held your pomander to your nose. Some people sent servants to market rather than going themselves, using their privilege to reduce their own risk while exposing their servants. Others went at odd hours, early morning or late evening, when the market was less crowded. Some switched to buying from street vendors who came to their neighborhoods, though these vendors charged more. The vendors themselves faced terrible choices. They needed to sell their goods to survive, but every customer contact was a potential source of infection. Some vendors would lay out their goods and stand back, letting customers pick what they wanted and leave money without direct contact. Others rigged up barriers, passing goods through windows or over counters designed to maintain distance. The economics of plague outbreaks were fascinating and terrible. Prices for some goods skyrocketed because supply dried up. Farmers weren't bringing produce to plague-stricken London. Merchants weren't importing goods. But prices for other goods collapsed because demand disappeared. Who's buying luxury items during a plague? This volatility could ruin businesses overnight. Certain occupations became extremely valuable during plague outbreaks. Gravediggers could demand high wages. The work was dangerous and exhausting, and there was far more demand than supply. Nurses willing to care for plague victims were in demand. Cart drivers who transporting bodies. All of these jobs paid well because they were necessary but dangerous. Other occupations suffered. Innkeepers had no customers. Tailors, shoemakers, and other craftsmen found their businesses dying as people stopped buying non-essential goods. Street performers and entertainers had no audiences. The whole economy of the city shifted during plague outbreaks, becoming focused on bare survival. For families locked in quarantine, the economic impact could be devastating. If you're the breadwinner and you're shut up in your house, you can't work. You're not earning money, but you still need to eat. The parish was supposed to provide support, and in some cases did, but the system was overwhelmed during major outbreaks. Some quarantined families starved not from plague, but from lack of resources. This created an incentive to hide plague cases, as I mentioned earlier. If admitting someone in your family has plague means your whole household will be locked up and you'll lose your income, you might be tempted to conceal the illness. This was illegal and dangerous. It helped spread the plague, but it was understandable. The emotional life of plague-time London was dominated by fear and grief. Fear that you or your loved ones would get sick. Fear that the plague would never end. Fear of being locked up. Fear of dying alone. Grief for all those who had died. Grief for the life that had been lost, the normal, everyday pleasures that plague had stolen. People dealt with this in different ways. Some became deeply religious, finding comfort in faith. Some turned to alcohol or other escapes. Some became fatalistic, figuring if death was coming, there was nothing they could do about it. Some channeled their fear into action, helping neighbors, caring for the sick, doing what they could to fight back against the plague. There were small acts of kindness that must have meant everything to those on the receiving end. A neighbor leaving food outside the door of a quarantined family. A doctor visiting a poor patient even though they couldn't pay. A gravedigger taking extra care with a child's burial. A priest sitting with a dying person so they wouldn't be alone. These acts of compassion happened daily during the plague years, and they mattered enormously. There were also acts of cruelty and selfishness. People hoarding food, employers abandoning workers, landlords evicting tenants who couldn't pay rent because they were locked in quarantine, neighbors reporting each other to authorities to get them shut up. The plague brought out both the best and worst in people. What's striking, reading accounts from the plague years, is how life continued even in the midst of catastrophe. People fell in love, Barbies were born, couples got married. Children played in the streets when the streets weren't too dangerous. There were moments of joy and beauty even during the darkest times. Life insisted on happening, even when death was everywhere. This resilience, this insistence on living even in the face of death, is one of the most powerful aspects of the human story during the plague years. People refused to give up. They kept hopping, they kept building, they kept loving, and eventually they prevailed. The plague ended and London lived on. All right, you're doing great, sticking with this epic journey through history. We're building something special here together, you and me, diving deep into these stories that shaped our world. If you're getting value from this, show some love with a like and drop a comment about what you're thinking. And seriously, if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button for dreamless timelines. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about how plague influenced London's physical development and architecture. The repeated plague outbreaks over 3 centuries had a real impact on how the city was built and rebuilt. After the Great Fire of 1666, when London was reconstructed, there was an opportunity to reimagine the city's layout. Christopher Wren, the famous architect, proposed a grand plan with wide streets radiating from central points, open squares, and buildings set back from roadways. It was a beautiful, rational design that would have created a more spacious, healthy city, but it was never implemented. Property owners wanted to rebuild on their old lots. The cost of Wren's plan was prohibitive. The need to rebuild quickly outweighed the desire to rebuild perfectly. Still, the new London that emerged was different from the old. Buildings were required to be brick or stone rather than timber, reducing fire risk and probably making them less hospitable to rats. Streets were somewhat wider. There was more attention to drainage and water supply. The new London wasn't perfect, but it was an improvement. Over the following decades and centuries, as London continued to grow, there was increasing attention to public health in urban planning. The connection between crowded, dirty conditions and disease, while not perfectly understood, was recognized. Efforts were made to widen streets, improve sanitation, provide clean water, build parks and open spaces. These efforts were often driven by concerns about diseases other than plague, particularly cholera in the 19th century, but the legacy of the plague years influenced thinking. London had learned, painfully, that urban conditions affected health. The memory of plague pushed the city toward reforms that made it a healthier place to live. The development of London's sewer system in the 19th century, the creation of parks like Hyde Park and Regent's Park, the gradual improvement of housing standards, all of these can be seen, in part, as responses to the lesson of plague that you can't ignore public health without paying a terrible price. Architecturally, some buildings from the plague years still stand in London today. Churches that served as parish churches during plague outbreaks. Houses where plague victims lived and died. Walking through certain parts of London, particularly in the Old City and the East End, you're walking through neighborhoods that experienced plague firsthand. It's a strange feeling, knowing that the very streets you're on were once filled with death carts, that the buildings you're passing once had red crosses painted on their doors. There are also memorials to the plague, plaques marking where plague pits were located. The monument, built to commemorate the Great Fire, also serves as a reminder of the plague that preceded it. These physical markers keep the memory alive, connecting modern London to its plague-stricken past. In literature and popular culture, the plague years have been depicted countless times. From contemporary accounts like Pepys's Diary and Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, to modern novels, films, and television shows, the story of London's plagues continues to fascinate. There's something compelling about it, the scale of the disaster, the human drama, the mystery of why it ended. In recent years, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been renewed interest in historical pandemics. People look back at the plague years trying to understand how societies cope with epidemic disease, what works and what doesn't, how people manage fear and grief and disruption. The parallels are imperfect. COVID is not bubonic plague, but there are lessons to be learned. One lesson is the importance of accurate information. During the plague years, people acted on incorrect theories about disease causation, which led to ineffective or counterproductive measures. Today, we have much better scientific knowledge, but we still struggle with misinformation. The plague years remind us how crucial it is to base public health responses on solid evidence. Another lesson is about inequality. Plague hit the poor harder than the rich, and that inequity shaped both the course of the disease and society's response. The same is true of modern pandemics. Disease doesn't affect everyone equally, and our responses need to account for that. A third lesson is about human resilience. The people of plague-era London endured something horrific, but they survived. They rebuilt. They moved forward. That resilience is inspiring and reminds us that we too can get through difficult times. Now let me take you into some specific medical procedures and treatments that were used during the plague years, because while they didn't work, they're fascinating in revealing how people thought about disease and healing. Bloodletting, which I've mentioned, was the most common medical procedure. The theory was that plague caused an excess of blood or corrupted blood, so removing some of it would restore balance. Physicians would open a vein, usually in the arm, and drain blood into a bowl. The amount varied, sometimes just a cup, sometimes much more. Patients would be bled repeatedly over the course of their illness. This practice was not only useless against plague, but actively harmful. It weakened patients who were already fighting a serious infection. But physicians genuinely believed it helped, and patients expected it. There was an elaborate theory about which veins to bleed based on the location of symptoms and astrological considerations. Certain times of day or certain phases of the moon were considered better for bloodletting. It was a whole system, completely wrong, but internally consistent based on their understanding of how the body worked. Cupping was another common treatment. Glass cups would be heated and applied to the skin. As they cooled, they created suction, supposedly drawing out harmful humors. Sometimes cupping was combined with scarification, making small cuts in the skin under the cup to draw blood. The resulting bruises and marks must have been dramatic, which probably made patients feel like something substantial was being done. For the buboes, those painful swellings that characterized bubonic plague, physicians tried various treatments. Some applied hot poultices made of herbs, bread, milk, or animal fat, believing heat would draw out the poison. Some tried to lance the buboes, cutting them open to drain the pus. which was incredibly painful and often led to secondary infections. Others applied caustic substances to burn the bubo, creating an open wound that would drain. Or they used dried toads or pigeon halves, literally cutting a pigeon in half and applying it to the bubo, based on a theory that the animal would draw out the poison. These treatments sound bizarre and they were ineffective, but they were taken seriously by medical professionals of the time. There were countless herbal remedies prescribed for plague. Theriac, which I mentioned earlier, was considered a cure-all. There was something called London treacle, a specific plague remedy containing dozens of ingredients. There were cordials made of saffron, angelica, and other exotic substances. There were purges made of senna or aloe to clear the bowels. Physicians wrote elaborate recipes for these remedies, and apothecaries compounded them and sold them at high prices. The wealthy could afford these medicines, while the poor made do with simpler home remedies or nothing at all. Whether you were rich or poor, though, none of the medicines worked. Plague didn't care about your social status or your expensive theriac. Some treatments might have provided comfort even if they didn't cure. Opium-based preparations would have eased pain and helped patients sleep. Alcohol-based cordials might have reduced anxiety. Herbal teas might have been soothing. In the absence of effective cures, comfort care was valuable even if physicians didn't think of it that way. There were also preventive measures people took. As I mentioned, carrying aromatic substances was common. Some people wore amulets or charms inscribed with prayers or mystical symbols. Some believed certain gemstones offered protection, so they wore them. Some ate specific diets, avoiding certain foods thought to encourage plague and consuming others believed to prevent it. Garlic was popular as a preventive, probably because of its strong smell which fit the theory that pleasant odors fought corrupted air. People would eat garlic, wear cloves of garlic around their necks, or hang it in their homes. Onions were similarly used. Neither actually prevents plague, but they might have had some mild antiseptic properties that could have helped with other ailments. Vinegar was considered a powerful disinfectant. People would wash their hands, faces, and mouths with vinegar. They'd soak coins in vinegar before handling them. They'd sprinkle vinegar around their houses. Vinegar does have some antimicrobial properties, so this wasn't entirely useless, though it wouldn't protect against plague transmitted by fleas. Fire was also seen as purifying. Bonfires were burned in the streets during plague outbreaks to cleanse the air. Homes were fumigated by burning aromatic substances like rosemary, juniper, or frankincense. This created a lot of smoke, which must have been unpleasant, but it was thought to drive out the plague miasma. In reality, the smoke probably just irritated people's lungs, but it gave them something to do, a sense of taking action. The variety of treatments and preventives shows both the desperation and the creativity of people facing plague. They tried everything they could think of. Some of it was based on ancient medical texts. Some of it was folk wisdom passed down through generations. Some of it was newer ideas from physicians trying to innovate. None of it worked against plague, but you can't fault people for trying. And here's something important to remember. Even though these treatments didn't work, the system of care around them mattered. When a physician visited a plague patient, even if the bloodletting he performed was useless, his presence provided comfort. The patient knew someone cared, someone was trying to help. When family members nursed a sick loved one, even if the poultices they applied did nothing, the act of caring mattered. Human connection in the face of death has value even when medical interventions don't work. This is something we sometimes forget in our modern medical system with its focus on evidence-based treatments and measurable outcomes. We have effective treatments now, thank goodness, but we shouldn't lose sight of the human element. Care matters, presence matters, hope matters. The plague doctors of London understood that, even if they didn't understand microbiology. Speaking of hope, let's talk about how people maintained hope during the plague years. It would have been easy to fall into despair, so many dead, so much suffering, no clear end in sight, but most people didn't give up. They found reasons to keep going. For many, religious faith provided hope. The belief that God had a plan, that suffering had meaning, that there was an afterlife where families would be reunited, these beliefs helped people endure. For others, hope came from more earthly sources. The knowledge that previous plague outbreaks had ended, eventually. The belief that maybe this summer would be different, maybe the plague wouldn't come back this year. Small signs that things might be improving. A week with fewer deaths than the week before, a neighboring parish declared plague-free. Family provided hope. If you had children to care for, you couldn't give up. You had to keep going for their sake. If you had a spouse or parents or siblings, you wanted to protect them, to stay alive for them. Love is a powerful motivator, even in the darkest circumstances. Work provided hope and purpose. If you were a baker, you kept baking bread because people needed to eat. If you were a physician, you kept treating patients because they needed help. If you were a priest, you kept ministering to your flock because they needed spiritual guidance. Continuing to do your job, to fulfill your role in society, gave you a sense of purpose and normalcy amid chaos. Community provided hope. When neighbors helped each other, when parishes organized support for the poor, when strangers showed kindness, it reminded people that they weren't alone. Humans are social creatures. We need connection. During the plague years, that need became even more acute, and people found ways to maintain connections even when physical proximity was dangerous. Simple pleasures provided hope. A sunny day, a good meal, a child's laughter, a moment of beauty in music or art or nature. These small joys reminded people that life was still worth living, that there was still good in the world despite all the bad. And curiosity provided hope, the human desire to understand, to know, to figure things out. Physicians studying plague weren't just going through the motions, they genuinely wanted to understand it. Scholars debating the causes of plague were engaged in a real intellectual quest. This drive to understand, even when understanding remained elusive, was itself a form of hope. It said, we refuse to just accept this, we're going to try to figure it out, we're going to try to do better. That curiosity eventually paid off. It took centuries, but humanity did eventually understand plague. We did figure it out. We did find ways to prevent and treat it. The hope wasn't misplaced. The belief that things could get better was ultimately vindicated. I want to take a moment here to acknowledge that you've been on this journey with me for a long time now. We've covered an enormous amount of ground together, from the first arrival of the Black Death in 1348 through the Great Plague of 1665 and beyond. We've explored the medical, social, economic, and emotional dimensions of London's plague years. We've heard individual stories and examined broad patterns. If you found this valuable, if you've learned something or felt something, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to Dreamless Timelines, hit that like button, and leave a comment. Your support makes it possible for me to create more content like this. Now let's talk about some of the aftermath and long-term consequences of the plague years, because the impact extended far beyond the immediate death toll. One major consequence was demographic. The repeated waves of plague, from 1348 onward, kept England's population suppressed for about 150 years. The population in 1500 was probably lower than it had been in 1300, before the Black Death. It wasn't until the late 16th and 17th centuries that population really started growing again, and even then, plague outbreaks periodically checked that growth. This demographic impact had huge economic consequences. With fewer people, there was less demand for goods, which hurt some industries, but there was also less labor available, which drove up wages and improved conditions for workers. The balance of power between labor and capital shifted. For the first time in centuries, ordinary working people had some leverage. This contributed to long-term social changes. The feudal system, which had been weakening anyway, essentially collapsed in the century after the Black Death. Peasants gained freedom. The middle class, merchants, professionals, skilled craftsmen grew larger and more influential. The rigid social hierarchy of medieval England became more fluid. Politically, the plague years influenced the development of state institutions. Governments took on new responsibilities for public health, tracking disease, managing quarantines, supporting the poor during outbreaks. This expansion of state power laid groundwork for the modern administrative state. The idea that government has a responsibility for public welfare, not just maintaining order and defending against enemies, was strengthened by the experience of managing plague. Intellectually, as I've mentioned, the plague years contributed to the questioning of traditional authorities. If ancient medical texts couldn't explain plague, if prayers couldn't stop it, maybe traditional learning wasn't sufficient. This skepticism helped create space for new approaches, for empirical investigation and experimentation. The scientific revolution of the 17th century didn't happen just because of plague. Many factors contributed, but plague was part of the context that made people open to new ways of thinking. Culturally, the plague years left a lasting imprint on European and English consciousness. The memento mori tradition, the reminder of death's inevitability, became deeply embedded in art and literature. The dance macabre motif appeared everywhere. Skulls and skeletons became common decorative elements. This wasn't morbid fascination, it was a realistic acknowledgement of life's fragility. This awareness of death influenced how people lived. There was paradoxically both a greater intensity of religious devotion and a greater emphasis on enjoying life while you can. The Protestant Reformation, which transformed English religious life in the 16th century, happened in the context of a society shaped by plague. The emphasis on individual faith, on direct relationship with God without priestly intermediaries, may have resonated partly because plague had shown that priests couldn't protect you, that ultimately you faced death alone. The plague years also influenced English literature in countless ways. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is set during the plague era and includes characters who reference it. Shakespeare's works are infused with plague imagery and metaphors. The metaphysical poets of the 17th century, like John Donne, wrote extensively about death and mortality, shaped by living in a plague-prone world. In medicine, the failure to cure plague motivated reforms. The establishment of the Royal College of Physicians in 1518 was an attempt to regulate medical practice and improve standards. The development of new hospitals and charitable institutions. The gradual professionalization of medicine and nursing. These changes happened over centuries, but they were driven in part by the challenge of dealing with epidemic disease. The concept of public health as a field emerged from the plague years. The bills of mortality that London published became a model for health statistics. The practice of quarantine, of isolating the sick, became standard procedure. The recognition that urban conditions, crowding, sanitation, water quality, affect health became established wisdom. These insights, gained through painful experience with plague, laid the foundation for modern public health. Now let's talk about what happened to London after plague finally ended. By the early 18th century, it's clear that plague is really gone. A generation has grown up without experiencing an outbreak. The fear begins to fade. London enters a period of explosive growth. The population soars, commerce flourishes. The city becomes the largest in Europe and then the largest in the world. This growth brings its own challenges: overcrowding, pollution, crime, new diseases like cholera and typhus. London in the 18th and 19th centuries faces serious public health problems, but they're different from plague. And the city has institutions and knowledge gained from fighting plague that help it tackle these new challenges. The development of modern epidemiology in the 19th century, pioneered by figures like John Snow, who traced a cholera outbreak to a contaminated water pump, built on methods developed during the plague years. The infrastructure investments that cleaned up Victorian London, the sewer system, the water supply, the housing reforms, were motivated by lessons learned from centuries of dealing with epidemic disease. In a strange way, London's future success was built partly on its plague experience. The city that emerged from the plague years was tougher, more resilient, with institutions and knowledge that served it well as it grew into a global metropolis. The suffering wasn't meaningless, it taught lessons that benefited future generations. There's something profoundly moving about that. The people who died of plague in medieval and early modern London didn't die in vain. Their deaths, documented in bills of mortality and parish registers, provided data. Their experiences, recorded in letters and diaries and official documents, provided knowledge. Their suffering motivated reforms. They contributed, unknowingly, to building a healthier world for those who came after. When we look back at the plague years now, from our vantage point of modern medicine and public health, we see both how far we've come and how much we owe to those who came before. We have antibiotics that can cure plague. We have vaccines that prevent many diseases. We have a scientific understanding of infection that would have seemed like magic to a 17th century Londoner. But we also have concepts and institutions, quarantine, public health departments, disease surveillance, that were born in the struggle against plague. And we've learned, or should have learned, important lessons. That disease is a collective problem requiring collective solutions. That prevention is better than cure. That we have to protect the most vulnerable, not just the privileged. That accurate information and good science are essential. That we're all in this together. That disease doesn't respect borders or social classes. That protecting one person helps protect everyone. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded us of these lessons. It gave modern people a tiny glimpse of what it was like to live in plague times, the fear, the disruption, the loss. Of course, COVID was far less deadly than plague, and we had scientific tools that medieval people lacked, but the psychological and social experience had some similarities. The uncertainty, the anxiety, the grief, the fatigue of living under threat for years. When COVID lockdown started, people looked back at historical plagues with new understanding. Oh, they thought this is what it was like. This fear of contagion, this need to isolate, this disruption of normal life. Except it lasted not 2 years but 3 centuries. The comparison gives new appreciation for what our ancestors endured. It also highlights how much better we can respond to pandemics now. COVID killed millions globally, which is terrible, but without modern medicine and public health measures, it would have killed tens of millions or more. The death rate from COVID was a small fraction of what plague's death rate was. We did better because we knew better, because we had the knowledge built over centuries of fighting disease, knowledge paid for with countless lives. Let me take you now through one final story, a composite that draws on many real accounts, to illustrate what I mean about the human cost and the human resilience of the plague years. Imagine a family living in London in 1348, a merchant family comfortably middle class. They have a house in the city, a shop selling cloth. There's John the father, his wife Alice, their 3 children, 2 teenage boys and a young daughter and a servant girl. When plague comes to London that autumn, John is worried but hopeful it won't reach his neighbourhood. He's heard the terrible stories from the continent, but surely England will be spared, surely God will protect them. But as winter arrives, plague appears in nearby parishes. John sends his family to stay with relatives in the countryside while he remains to mind the shop. By spring, plague is everywhere. John falls ill. He dies alone in his house, his body collected and buried in a plague pit. The shop closes. His family in the countryside waits for word. When they learn of his death, Alice is devastated but must be strong for her children. She returns to London to try to salvage the business. But London is changed, so many dead, so much chaos, the shop has been looted. Alice has no way to restart the business. She takes in sewing to survive. The boys who would have been apprenticed to their father must find their own way. The eldest gets work as a labourer, a step down in status but it pays. The younger boy becomes an apprentice to a shoemaker who lost his own apprentices to plague. The daughter, young Mary, survives the plague years and grows up in this transformed London. She marries a craftsman who's done well in the labour shortage after plague. They have children. Life goes on. Mary tells her children about their grandfather, about the world before plague, about the shop that was lost. The stories are passed down. Generations later, Mary's great-great-grandchildren are living in Elizabethan London. The plague still comes periodically, but it's less devastating than that first outbreak. The family has risen in status again. They own property. They're doing well. They remember their ancestor John who died in the first plague, and they remember Mary who survived and rebuilt. The story of resilience is part of their family identity. More generations pass. By the 1660s, Mary's descendants experience the Great Plague. Some die, others survive. They endure the Great Fire. They rebuild again. The family continues, adapting, surviving, persisting through centuries of change and challenge. By the 1700s, plague is gone. The family has been in London for 400 years, through all the plague outbreaks, through political upheavals, through fire and disease and wars. They're still here. They're part of London's fabric. The city's history is their history. This is the story of London itself, writ small. Plague struck again and again, but the city survived. People died by the hundreds of thousands, but others lived. Children were born. Businesses opened. Buildings were built. Art was created. Life continued. London persisted. And it wasn't just persistence, it was growth and transformation. London became greater because of what it endured, not in spite of it. The plague years forged the city's character, made it tougher, more adaptable, more resilient. The London that became the capital of a global empire, the centre of trade and culture and innovation, was built on foundations laid during the plague years. That's the ultimate meaning of the plague story, I think. It's not just about death and suffering, though there was plenty of that. It's about survival and resilience. It's about humans facing the worst and refusing to give up. It's about communities coming together in crisis. It's about knowledge slowly accumulated over generations. It's about hope persisting even in darkness. The people who lived through the plague years didn't know they were creating the future. They were just trying to survive the present. But their struggles, their choices, their courage shaped the world we live in. They built the institutions we rely on. They learned the lessons we still study. They faced the challenges that taught humanity how to deal with epidemic disease. So when we remember the London plague, we should remember both the horror and the heroism, the staggering death toll and the incredible resilience, the failure of medieval medicine and the seeds of modern public health, the suffering of individuals and the persistence of communities. All of it together makes up this remarkable story. And you know what? You made it. You've journeyed with me through the entire history of the London Plague, from the Black Death's arrival in 1348 through the Great Plague of 1665 and into the aftermath. We've covered 300 years of history together. If that's not worth a like and a subscribe, I don't know what is. Seriously, hit that subscribe button for dreamless timelines. Drop a comment telling me what you thought, what surprised you, what moved you. What would you like to hear about next? Let me bring this story to a close with some final reflections. The London Plague teaches us several profound lessons that remain relevant today. First, it teaches us about the power of disease to shape history. Plague didn't just kill people, it transformed society, economics, politics, culture, everything. Understanding our past requires understanding the role of disease in shaping that past. Second, it teaches us about human resilience. People endured 3 centuries of recurring plague outbreaks and still built one of the world's great cities. That's remarkable. It shows what humans are capable of when we refuse to give up. Third, it teaches us about the importance of knowledge. The suffering of plague victims in medieval London seems especially tragic because it was unnecessary. If only they'd known about bacteria and fleas and rats, so many could have been saved. This motivates us to seek knowledge, to support science and medicine, because knowledge saves lives. Fourth, it teaches us about inequality and how it affects health. Plague hit the poor harder than the rich. a pattern we see with every disease. This should motivate us to address health inequities, to ensure everyone has access to the resources needed to stay healthy. Fifth, it teaches us about the value of public health and collective action. The measures that eventually controlled plague, quarantine, sanitation, disease surveillance, required collective effort and public institutions. Individual action wasn't enough. We had to work together. That lesson remains vital. Sixth, it teaches us about adaptation and change. London after plague was different from London before. Society had to adapt to new realities. Some of those changes were positive: greater social mobility, higher wages for workers, stronger public health institutions. Change, even change forced by tragedy, can lead to improvement. Seventh, it teaches us about memory and how we process trauma. The plague years were traumatic for those who lived through them, yet people found ways to remember, to memorialize, to extract meaning from suffering. The stories we tell about difficult times matter. They shape how we understand ourselves and our world. And finally, it teaches us about hope. Despite everything, despite death all around them, people in plague-time London kept hopping. They kept believing things would get better. They kept working toward a better future, and they were right to hope because things did get better. Plague ended, London flourished, knowledge advanced. The future they hoped for came to pass, maybe not in their lifetime, but it came. That's what I want you to take away from this long journey through history. Yes, the plague years were terrible. Yes, countless people suffered and died, but humanity prevailed. We learned, we grew, we built a better world on the ruins of the old, and we can do that again, whatever challenges we face. The story of the London plague is ultimately a story of hope. Not cheap, easy hope that ignores suffering, but hardened hope that acknowledges pain and persists anyway. Hope that says we've faced worse and survived, we can face this too. Hope that says our struggles matter, they teach us, they make us stronger, they pave the way for those who come after. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, let this story settle into your mind. Let it remind you that humans are stronger than we sometimes think, that we can endure terrible things and come out the other side, that our ancestors faced challenges we can barely imagine and they made it through. That knowledge matters, that community matters, that resilience is real. The plague doctors in their beaked masks, walking through London's streets to tend the sick. The families locked in quarantine, caring for their dying loved ones. The gravediggers working day and night to bury the dead. The priests giving last rites despite the danger. The physicians seeking understanding even when it eluded them. The mothers protecting their children. The neighbors helping each other. The ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of catastrophe. These are your ancestors, not necessarily genetically, but historically, spiritually. Their struggles shape the world you live in. Their courage inspires us still. Their story is worth remembering, worth honoring, worth learning from. And now, as we come to the end of this journey, I want to thank you one more time for being here, for listening, for learning, for caring about history. If you found value in this story, please subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Give this video a like. Share it with someone who loves history. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your questions, your own reflections on what we've covered. The great city of London stands today, vibrant and alive, home to millions. It has faced and overcome countless challenges over its long history. The plague years are just one chapter, though a significant one in that ongoing story. The city endured, the people endured, life endured. And that's the final word on the London plague. It tried to destroy London. It killed hundreds of thousands. It disrupted life for 3 centuries, but it didn't win. London survived. London thrived. London became one of humanity's great achievements, a city of culture, commerce, innovation, diversity. Built on the bones of plague victims, yes, but also built by survivors who refused to give up. That's the story. That's the whole long, complex, tragic, inspiring story of the London plague. From the first deaths in 1348 to the final outbreak in 1665 and beyond, through all the suffering and all the courage, through all the loss and all the persistence, that's the story. Sleep well, knowing that you're part of a long human story of survival and hope. Dream well, carrying the knowledge that we've faced darkness before and found our way through. Rest well, confident that the challenges of today, like the challenges of the past, can be overcome with knowledge, courage, and community. The London plague is history now. We've learned its lessons, we've honored its victims, we've celebrated its survivors, and we carry forward the wisdom gained from those terrible years, making our world a little bit safer, a little bit healthier, a little bit better. Good night, fellow travelers through history. Until we meet again for another journey into the past, sleep peacefully. And remember, no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes. London's plague years proved that. After 3 centuries of darkness, the plague ended. Light returned. Life continued. And it always will. The end.